Alright, everybody, welcome back to the Texas podcast. Today, I'm going to be starting a new series in my podcast called Weird But True. Basically about weird stories, but they're true, that little twist. But so, when it comes to colonial nations or colonial empires, you have a few present or past countries that, may pop into your head. The British Empire, of course, or France, Spain, maybe also the United States, or Portugal. However, there were plenty of nations that had their own small colonial empires. For example, Sweden had a few short-lived colonies, as well as Austria, but they were so small and ended so quickly that they never ended up being remembered for being a colonial empire. A nation somewhere in the middle was Belgium. Belgium did have its own colonies for a brief while, but it wasn't anywhere close to the size of most other colonial nations. However, despite that, they had one of the most infamous colonial regimes, the Belgian Congo, where they conducted a series of slave-based labor, profiteering, and genocidal atrocities that are so bad, you wouldn't even want to see pictures of it. So after World War I, they acquired Rwanda from the Germans and set up a system that put the Huttists in charge over the Tutsis, which would lead to our Rwandan genocide much later in the 1990s. So basically, despite being one of the smallest colonial empires, Belgium's actions would end up being responsible for two of the most horrible genocides of the 20th century. So they're certainly a notable player, but those places in Africa weren't the only attempts at colonization. The very first Belgian king, Leopold I, wanted Belgian colonies, but they all failed. Belgium was a very new country by European standards, having only acquired independence in 1830 from the Netherlands, and they still fought for it almost a whole another decade. Leopold was selected as a king in 1831, and he saw colonies as a way to prove the world that Belgium is a distinguishable modern country. If that line of reasoning sounds familiar, it's because it was reasoning also used as various points by the United States and Japan for their own colonies later on. Leopold I wanted to keep his options open at the Belgian archives within, I don't want to butcher that name, but yeah, Leopold expressed interest, and there were a few such ideas as India, the Philippines, or perhaps an area on the African coast, but most of his ambitions were in the Americas. Alright, let's see what Leopold's American ambitions were. Oh, well, that is certainly ambitious. Alright, despite Leopold being open to many ideas, in reality, he didn't have that many feasible ones. The early, yet 1800s, by colonial empires outside of the coastline, as the interior was not only a mystery, but the technology that would make exploring and conquering it easier wasn't even invented yet. Meanwhile, somewhere like India would be difficult for someone of their size to conquer, especially with multiple nations already competing over it. That's why so many of Leopold's ambitions are in the Americas, but colonizing anywhere in the Americas had its problems too. Firstly, the most of it was already controlled by an American or European power already. Secondly, even if they had picked an area they could colonize, there would be the problem of the United States, which might enforce its Monroe Doctrine, meaning that the U.S. would basically be against any new attempts of colonization in the Americas from any European power. But, alright, where did they end up actually trying though? Well, before I answer that question, we need to understand how colonies can imply different things. Some colonies are about settling a population in a different area, and perhaps trying to acquire economic benefits, while others are just flat-out empire buildings. These two types of colonies aren't really quite the same, even though we would call them both a colonization. Leopold wanted more of the empire-building type of colony, but Belgium's parliament wasn't so enthusiastic about that and preferred more of the simple economic investment kind of colony. But regardless, Belgium was going to try, and one of those areas they tried was Texas. Yeah, Texas, the Lone Star State. So quite similar to Belgium, Texas was also a brand new breakaway nation at that time in the 1830s, having won its independence from Mexico. But with the disputed borders between Mexico and Texas, there's high tensions and the need for Texas to acquire potential allies. Belgium thought perhaps it'd be a good place to get something official from Belgium and Texas correspondence about things such as monetary loans and economic supply deals to build relationships with others. But Texas is very much in need of support. So the Loan Commissioner of Texas, General James Hamilton, wrote a letter in 1841 that contained something that intrigued the Belgian foreign minister. Tell me if you notice something interesting in this portion of the letter. The supply of firearms, munitions of war, and steam machinery to Liege alone will be worth the guarantee, whilst the cotton, linen, and woolen manufacturers of Belgium, and to the trade of navigation in Antwerp, the boon will be greatly augmented in value, to say nothing of probably an ultimate territorial acquisition. Wow, okay. So, you can see that ultimate territorial acquisition part was interpreted as potential colonial territory. That phrase, ultimate territorial acquisition, was interpreted as potential colonial territory. Leopold sent a man by the name of Captain Victor Pearson on a diplomatic mission to check out Texas and to further discuss details. Pearson finally arrived after a multi-month journey in the early 1842. And after that long journey, got an update immediately upon landing in Galveston that Texas turns out that they rescinded their offer for land, because it turns out also that General James Hamilton was kind of offering more than he was allowed to, but Texas was fine with Belgian settlers founding their own communities along the frontiers. Coincidentally disputed with the Mexicans and Comanche Native Americans. But while Pearson wasn't able to get what he initially thought he was going to get, he still ended up visiting several cities in Texas and writing reports about the Republic of Texas. And supposedly Pearson himself said he had an enjoyable time in Texas, according to him, but Belgium never ended up getting that colony. But hey, they were allowed to send settlers whenever they want. Woohoo! I guess. So, that's a weird story. And that just leaves off the story of when Belgium tried to colonize Texas for their quote-unquote empire. And that leaves off that weird story. Anyways, I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you all for tuning in. Tomorrow is the premiere of, the Texas History Podcast. So I hope you all stay tuned to watch that. See you all next time.